People come to this country and you're their ambassador and you get to show it off. Especially like here in Denver, because it's pretty cool.
WorldDenver is a community organization that works with international visitors, bringing them for professional and cultural exchange programs through the U.S. Department of State.
We bring about 600 international visitors to Denver every year through international exchange programs. The economic impact of the WorldDenver exchange programs is vast. Our visitors spend it not only on hotels and transportation and tourism, but also in the experience while they're here in Denver. And so every dollar invested by the federal government through international exchange is returned tenfold on its investment.
When we are exposed to other people from different cultures, it allows us to really have an appreciation and develop empathy.
Being able to connect Americans to people around the world and show them that they have something to teach and they have something to learn.
A lot of times when people come in, they're very curious. I mean, they have these systems in place in their own respective countries, but they strive for something new.
We were able to sit there and discuss just how their roles, either within their government or in the educational system, or just as a teacher, and how that differs from what they've experienced here in the US and what they think they can take back to their country.
These individuals will learn about us, or what we enjoy doing, we learn what they love doing, and we walk away thinking, we are similar, even though we're coming from different parts of the world.
Homestays are members or people in our community who are willing to host participants.
And it's just a chance to get to know and to socialize and interact with just the different cultures that come into our home.
Coming for a meal is a chance to be informal, a chance to laugh, a chance to stretch in a different way.
It's really important to understand perspectives other than your own, and meeting with international visitors enables that. It allows you to learn about their culture, learn about their society, and see things from a different perspective.
It really helps us here in Denver to be more globally competent and more globally fluent, and that really is what great cities are. They're connected around the world, and it's the people that help us to be connected around the world.
Welcome everyone. I'm Amanda Mountain, the President and CEO of Rocky Mountain Public Media. It's such a pleasure to have you in the Buell Public Media Center. This is one of our first community events, which is only fitting because we have been partners between Rocky Mountain PBS and WorldDenver for many, many years. We are so happy to welcome you here back in community. It's been so long for so many of us, myself included. Our mission at Rocky Mountain Public Media is a Colorado where everyone is seen and heard. And that really starts by acknowledging the rich depth that we have within our state's history and how we are connected to the broader world. So we are so grateful that WorldDenver trusts us with this partnership. If you're not familiar with Rocky Mountain Public Media, we're the largest membership organization in the state with about 95,000 members in every county in Colorado. And our organization includes Rocky Mountain PBS, Kuvo Jazz Radio, and The Drop, which is one of the country's first hip-hop R&B stations within public media. In this facility, we house many, many partners, so we really like to think of the Buell Public Media Center as the state capital for local journalism. We have in this building something called the Colorado News Collaborative, CoLab. We have the Associated Press and the Colorado Sun and Chalkbeat and over a dozen local media organizations that are here to serve as lifelines for trusted news and information. We also have a community media center where people can come in and learn how to gain access to tools and training to tell your own stories. So together we're really happy to bring these types of events to Coloradans. We're all devastated by the unprovoked attack on Ukraine, and we are grateful for the opportunity to hear from such experts in this arena so that we can understand how this impacts our world and how we can impact a more just world around us. So with that, I will introduce the CEO of WorldDenver, John Krieger.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and let me just say how thrilled we are to be in this space and how thrilled we are that this space exists here in Denver. My name is John Krieger. I'm the Executive Director of WorldDenver. As you saw in the video, we are a nonprofit membership organization that connects Denver to the world through international exchange programs, global engagement events, and K-12 education initiatives. When we first started discussing tonight's event with Dr. Hill and her staff at the end of last year, the world had a Russia challenge. There was a buildup on the border and a looming threat to the sovereignty of Russia's neighbor, Ukraine. Now, as everyone here in this room knows, that threat has become an unprovoked invasion and a generation-defining crisis with a devastating human toll. To help us understand the crisis and make sense of what seems like the nonsensical, we are pleased to be joined by these two top experts on Russia and Europe. And I'll start with our moderator, and if you all will take the stage. Our moderator, Dr. Rachel Epstein, is a professor of international relations and European politics at the Korbel School of International Studies. She holds degrees from Cornell and Stanford University and has published widely on subjects concerning expansion of NATO, the European Union, and the developmental prospects of post-communist countries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Epstein. And then there's Dr. Fiona Hill. Dr. Hill is maybe the foremost expert on Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and Vladimir Putin in the country. She wrote the book on Mr. Putin. In fact, it's literally called Mr. Putin. She has counseled Republican and Democratic presidential administrations on Russia and Europe, and I hope she's counseling the current one. She served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russian and European Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019, and currently she is a Senior Foreign Policy Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fiona Hill. Now I'm going to get off this stage and let these brilliant minds take over. Before I do, the last 20 minutes or so will be reserved for audience questions, and we'll ask you to raise your hand, and our moderator will recognize you. And as we always do as a community, I'll encourage you to practice civility, respect, and brevity in your questions. Thank you so much, and enjoy.
So I am thrilled to be here. This is such an honor to have Dr. Fiona Hill with us.
You can't hear?
Can't hear. I will just keep talking, and I'm going to assume that they're going to work it out.
Yep.
Thank you. So, Dr. Hill, what I'd like to ask you at the beginning, given that we do have this enormous crisis now in Europe with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to give us your assessment of how we arrived at this moment. I will just say by way of perhaps framing what my understanding of the conflict is about, but I want to hear your interpretation. In some sense, the West is saying this conflict is about democratic sovereignty and the right of a country, such as Ukraine, to decide for itself with whom it is allied, with whom it associates. Vladimir Putin has said something entirely different, that the West is...
Can't hear you. You still can't hear? Okay.
It's only my mic that's a problem.
Maybe if you try to take it off and...
Okay, let me try this. Is that better? Okay, yeah. I'll just hold it like that. A little constrained. Plus I can hold it.
This is microphone and wardrobe malfunction.
Okay, yeah.
That's right.
I don't want to start doing yoga up here. So you can hear it's fine. Okay, I'll just sit awkwardly like this. So, getting back to the first question, let's begin by talking exactly about what this conflict is about.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. I'll try this. Let me see. All right. How are we doing? Can you hear at the back? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, as we said, we've all had challenges, not just the Russia challenge. This is the Kremlin gremlins at work here, right? I think that's what's happening. Yeah.
They're following us around.
They are following us around. Yeah, this happened earlier as well. So there's something about this topic that is obviously challenging us. In any case, we're going to hear, and you have been hearing in the press, an awful lot of reasons for Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. First of all, that this is about NATO and NATO enlargement. And I'd like to point out that a lot of the pressure on Ukraine from Russia actually started back in the early 1990s, before there was any discussion of NATO enlargement, in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the main frame for what's happening now is to think about the collapse of an empire, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was in many respects the continuation of the Russian Empire, even though there was a different configuration and obviously a different political system. And when the Soviet Union first fell apart, it didn't really collapse. It was actually pulled apart by inter-elite rivalries and by the decision of Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of the Russian Federation within the Soviet Union, to try to outmaneuver Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Secretary General of the Communist Party and the first president of the Soviet Union, in a power struggle, and basically to depose Gorbachev by getting together with the presidents, the leaders of the two republics of Belarusia and Ukraine in a hunting lodge in Belarus in 1991, and basically dissolve the Soviet Union and create what they thought would be the successor state, the Commonwealth of Independent States. Now, this is all relevant because they assumed that all of the places, all of the republics would stay together in a political entity. And Vladimir Putin often says that this wouldn't have happened if the Commonwealth of Independent States was still in place, because Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and all of the other former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, for example, would have all still been members of this Commonwealth of Independent States, all still in the same political, economic, and security space. Well, if any of you know anything about the British Empire, when it was dissolved, it set up the British Commonwealth. Canada was in it, Australia, New Zealand, Kenya, all kinds of countries. What's left of the Commonwealth these days is the Commonwealth Games, sporting events. This is not exactly a political powerhouse on the world stage. The Queen is still the Queen in some places, but it really didn't keep the empire together. That never happens, right? When people have the chance to leave an empire, they usually rush for the exits and want to sort of set up things for themselves. And that's exactly what happened in the early 1990s. So Ukraine was one of the first of new states to leave the Commonwealth of Independent States. Ukraine, along with Belarus, had also inherited a massive nuclear arsenal. Kazakhstan the same from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the early 1990s, Ukraine was one of the largest nuclear powers in the world, along with Belarus and Kazakhstan. And there was a lot of pressure on in that period, from us as well, here in the United States, not surprisingly, to try to persuade Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to give up the nuclear arsenal. I mean, you know a thing or two about that sitting here in Denver with all the Minutemen and all the air bases, things near here as well. We were really worried about loose nukes, nuclear proliferation. We put a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians and promised them that their independence and territorial sovereignty would be guaranteed if they gave up their nuclear weapons and sent them to Russia to be dismantled. Well, let's just say it didn't quite work out as planned back in the early 1990s, and a promise was given to them by the US and the United Kingdom, along with Russia, in 1994, that nothing like this would happen. So NATO wasn't even in the picture at that particular point, but there was a lot of pressure from Russian politicians, including the mayor of Moscow, the members of the Russian parliament, particularly nationalists, to basically try to pull the Ukrainians back in. A lot of threats to Ukraine when they left the Commonwealth of Independent States, a lot of threats to Ukraine about the nuclear arsenal. And, for a lot of intents and purposes, from our perspective, that all kind of faded away in the 1990s. We didn't really think about it. But many people who ended up in the circles around Vladimir Putin never forgot about that. So a lot of Putin's views are shaped by that early sense that Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and all these other Soviet republics got away. And from Putin's perspective, the loss of Ukraine and Belarus in particular, and the northern lands of Kazakhstan that had been settled by Russian speakers, was the greatest loss of all. Because that was the historic lands that were populated by Slavs, Russian speakers, and in Putin's view of history, they belonged, still with Moscow, under Moscow's control, with Russia. He talks about this repeatedly. He talks about the loss of these lands, the loss of the Russian world, and all of that has melded together with more recent worries and concerns about NATO, views that he's in a struggle with the West and with the United States on a political level. But the real origins of this come back to that sense of the loss of the Soviet Union and things turning out not in the way that people in Moscow, including people like Vladimir Putin, really expected.
Thank you for that answer. I mean, that's historically...
You have to...
Okay. Now I'm going to listen to myself echo. It's okay. So I don't, in some sense, doubt anything you're saying about how Putin views the tragedy of the Soviet Union's dissolution, but there was another element that evolved over time in Ukraine, which was its increasing democratization, its westernization, and me looking at the Russian regime, Putin's rule there, one thing that comes to mind, and this was true in Belarus as well, when they were experiencing large-scale democratic protests in the summer of 2020, that it's very hard for somebody like Putin to hold on to power if he's increasingly surrounded by protest-inclined populations that want to have association agreements with the EU, that want to draw closer to NATO. I guess what I've wondered about the framing of the conflict is it the increasing democratization, westernization of countries like Ukraine, which is Putin's true concern, as opposed to the stated concern about the appropriateness of having a Russian world in which Ukraine is naturally embedded?
Yeah, these things are all linked together because, we call it westernization and democratization. It's really about, countries developing in their own independent way. There are many different forms of democracy, right, around the world. It just so happens that Ukraine, like Russia and like the United States, has a presidential system. There are parliamentary systems. Growing up in the United Kingdom, very different paths, that all take different forms. But it's really about, the right to run your country or to be citizens in a country, to have your own voice and to have your own views about how things should play out. And there's a great quote by a colleague of mine, Lucian Kim, in a recent article that he wrote for the Kennan Institute, one of the think tanks in Washington, D.C. And Lucian Kim was the bureau chief until quite recently for NPR, so some of you might have heard him reporting from Moscow. And Lucian said that the Russians remain the subjects of their ruler, even all these years out after the end of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. But Ukrainians have become citizens of their own country, which is, what all of us are, right? We all have a voice, we all have a say. Democracy's messy. We change governments all the time. In Ukraine, they've changed their government repeatedly as well. In Ukraine, pretty much everybody thinks they're a president and everybody thinks they can be a president. And, they've got Volodymyr Zelensky, who was a comedian and played a president on television and became a president. And they've had multiple presidents and they have, a lot of corrupt politics. We have that as well. Other countries have that too. But people feel they're free to express themselves. And over the last 30 years of Ukraine's independence, a lot of Russians have gone to live in Ukraine as well. And people have, from Ukraine have taken advantage of freedom of movement, especially through association with the European Union since 2017 or so, to move around the world. Maybe some of you here have Ukrainian ancestry from earlier waves of migration out of Ukraine. Chicago, for example, was a Ukrainian village of, earlier waves. But, these days, we're all just a couple of degrees away from a Ukrainian or somebody who knows a Ukrainian. Ukrainians have become us. They're more like us. They've, moved around. Yeah, everything is messy, as I said, in their democracy. But they've moved away from Russia. And what they've moved away from is this central control that is still a major feature of the Russian political system. In many respects, the Russian presidency over time has become more like the old Tsarist system. it's a centralization of power and a personification of power. The Russian constitution that was first put in place in the 1990s was written by a number of constitutional scholars that had actually studied the attempts under the Tsarist system to create a constitutional monarchy. And they said that they were basing their model of the presidency on the Queen of England, which is a little weird, actually, because the Queen of England, as we know, doesn't really have that much power. But it was that idea of a constitutional monarchy, but all of the power being basically centered in that individual. And one of those scholars who worked on that first constitution was none other than Anatoly Sobchak, who was Putin's law professor at Leningrad State University and later his boss when he became the mayor of St. Petersburg, previously Leningrad, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Putin worked for him as a deputy mayor. So Putin's very well aware of the thinking behind the constitution. And basically, Vladimir Putin has no checks and balances on him in the Russian system. He believes in the Russian state, in the power of the state and using the state. But as the president, he's not the member of a political party. And the only way that he legitimates himself is for direct appeal to the people. And it's a way, in many respects, a very populist system. Elections are more like a referendum on Putin because there's never really any opposition who runs against him. And in fact, the last time they had an election, the opponent was Ksenia Sobchak. Sobchak, his old boss and old law professor's daughter. You can, and you know, the rumor is that Putin's hit her godfather. So hardly an opponent, you know, who's in a meaningful way. And so all the opposition is crushed. Alexei Navalny, obviously the most, I would say, potentially the most dangerous political opponent for Vladimir Putin at this particular point, has just, you know, managed to survive an assassination attempt in a rather gruesome fashion and is now in a penal colony. Basically, the whole system revolves around Putin. Now, we see in Ukraine that's just not the case. And prior to the invasion, and this is where Putin might have miscalculated, people were complaining in Ukraine about their government. They were complaining about Zelensky. They were complaining about the standard of living. They weren't being arrested for it. They could go out there and protest. And Putin probably read that and thinking, you know, Ukraine's weak. They don't really believe in their institutions. This, you know, kind of could very easily work if, you know, for invasion, the Ukrainians will crumble, they'll fall apart. And, you know, they'll subject themselves quite quickly to Russian rule, particularly as there's so many Russian speakers in Ukraine. He didn't understand what had happened there over the 30 years of Ukraine building itself up as an independent state, of people having a voice, and people really becoming attached to the place where they are, becoming citizens of a modern Ukraine, not subjects of, let's just say, not even a postmodern, but, you know, kind of a pre-modern ruler.
Okay, well, so it's come up sort of peripherally, but we should talk about it directly, which is the issue of NATO enlargement. And I'll do this. Just continue to signal me. So if you don't hear, just let me know. So from the US and at the time Western Europe's perspective, in retrospect, was that policy of NATO enlargement a mistake? And I say this, I ask this as somebody who started researching this issue in the 1990s, was very skeptical initially, but through research actually believed it was a great thing for Central East European countries, because at the time anyway, in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was much about securing those countries from one another and dampening regional rivalries in Europe, as it was against Russia. But in retrospect, was it worth that tamping down of regional rivalries in Europe, given the apparent backlash that it elicited from Putin?
Yeah, but it's a great question, and it's a really wonderful formulation, because, you know, I think all of us have lost sight now of the early 1990s. I mean, we were all a lot younger, but a lot of time has passed. But, you know, that point that you made, that we were worried about ethnic conflicts, not just in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, but as you point out, there was a lot of irredentist claims of, you know, various countries against the others. The Hungarians, for example, had a lot of disputes that went back through history with their immediate neighbours, because Hungarians, after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there's a lot of empire links here, basically, found that Hungarian-speaking populations were in other countries, including, actually in Ukraine, across the Carpathian Mountains, but in Romania, for example, large populations, and elsewhere in the Balkan region, and everybody was really worried that in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and this new kind of free-for-all, that we would get more of these conflicts, and it wasn't exactly a peaceful demise. And I think we've lost sight of that. That was one of the reasons of bringing in countries and hoping that then, because one of the prerequisites of entry into NATO was resolving ethnic conflicts. So we didn't want to bring countries in with territorial conflicts. And it was very similar with the European Union as well. And so that was an incentive, to figure out how to negotiate way out of these problems. But if one looks at NATO from purely the Russian perspective, as many people did in that early period, it didn't look particularly advisable to extend NATO. And my own PhD dissertation advisor and history professor, Richard Pipes, who many of you may have heard of, a very famous historian of Russia and of the formation of the Soviet Union and the communist regime, who was no friend of certainly the Soviet Union, was extremely worried about what the implications of expanding NATO would be, because he already saw that there would be a backlash by the Russians, because this was the military alliance that had been set up during the Cold War to contain Russia, constrain Russia. It was defensive, but the whole idea was obviously that any kind of action would be triggered by a confrontation with the Soviet Union. And so the question was, once the Cold War had ended, once the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's similar military bloc had gone away, then what was NATO against? Now, what you were saying here was, of course, in the early 1990s, we in the United States and elsewhere saw NATO for something, as a kind of an exercise in conflict resolution, expanding kind of broader values and participation in Europe. But from the Russian perspective, it was against them still. And George Kennan, the famous diplomat, felt the same way, spoke out against NATO enlargement, and many others. And I have to say that from my own perspective, as a younger scholar, I also thought this didn't seem like a great idea. But the Eastern European countries wanted to become members of NATO as well, not just for conflict resolution purposes, because the first 3 countries that asked to be members of NATO were Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland. Now, what do they all have in common? 1956, the Soviet invasion of Hungary. 1968, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And in the 1980s, not quite invasion, but pretty much one, of putting pressure on Poland when it also tried to head off in its own direction. And Hungary, the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, and Poland had all actually tried within the Soviet bloc to do what Ukraine has done over the last 30 years, which is exert their own independence and for people to be citizens of their own country and not always be beholden to Moscow. And Moscow had clamped down on them. So they wanted to be part of NATO for not just defensive reasons, but also to create a much bigger political, military and security space between them and Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union. So it was all logical from their perspective. Now, we had criteria for membership into NATO. And initially in the 1990s, we had, an arrangement that I myself had forgotten about, so I started thinking about it more recently, the Partnership for Peace. And, some of us think that it might have been a great idea to keep Partnership for Peace, particularly with the peace word at the end of it. The whole idea was that the countries that were not likely to join NATO could have all kinds of interactions with the military-to-military ties, and that would substitute for NATO membership, but would bind the countries together. And Russia was also a member of Partnership for Peace in those early days. But that wasn't sufficient for countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. They immediately wanted to get into NATO, as, not surprisingly, did the Baltic states, that had been forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union during World War II. And then, a host of other countries in Eastern Europe as well. But the criteria were that they had to basically follow several steps, a membership action plan. Now, we changed the rules in an unexpected fashion a little later in 2008. and I can just talk about that for a moment. But I first want to say that in 1999, something also changed, which Putin in particular thought changed the rules. In 1999, we intervened in the wars in Yugoslavia, and under US leadership, there was a NATO operation that bombed Belgrade. You might remember this happening in 1999. We also accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy because we had old maps and we didn't realize that Chinese embassy was right next door to the target, and some Chinese diplomats died. So this became a real problem. But Putin at the time was in charge of the security services. It was during his pretty meteoric rise from being an unknown member of the KGB, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and suddenly head of the security services, the FSB, the successor to the KGB, and then a deputy prime minister. And he's beginning his rise just as NATO bombs Belgrade with the United States' decision to intervene. And I happened to be in St. Petersburg at that period at a conference, and every Russian at that conference had a really, I would just say from my perspective, initially what seemed like an over-the-top shocked reaction to this. It wasn't that they didn't just see this coming, because of all the things that were happening in Kosovo at the time, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing. I mean, they knew all of that. But it was that NATO would bomb not just Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, the capital of a former larger country, Yugoslavia, but they thought there was no premise for this, because they always thought that there had to be an Article 5 event, in other words, a trigger. So basically NATO coming under attack or a NATO member, and that hadn't happened because the Kosovo Albanians at the time were not NATO members. And so the Russians couldn't figure this out. So they said, you are an offensive military alliance. This isn't defensive. Nobody did anything to you, to NATO. What happened? So this was every Russian at the conference, no matter what their perspective was shocked by this. And then when we used NATO in later operations in Iraq, in Libya, and Afghanistan, they became convinced that basically NATO was not what we were saying and we were lying to them, because we were always saying it was a defensive alliance. Now, 9/11, obviously, that did trigger Article 5. And Afghanistan, Putin himself understood our desire then and need and necessity to intervene, and why we might use NATO. But in these other operations, we were using NATO obviously for convenience, because we've had all of this years of coordination and working together on military front. But basically, Putin and the people around him were seeing this very differently from 1999 onwards, and we should have been mindful of that. And we should have been figuring out how we communicated with them more clearly, how we took steps to mitigate this response, and how we processed ourselves that this might be seen in a different light. And 2008 becomes a real turning point, again from Putin's point of view. Because in 2008, and you were telling me that you'd just gone back and read the NATO statement from the Bucharest summit in April of 2008, NATO said that Georgia and Ukraine would become members of NATO without any criteria applied. No, Georgia and Ukraine had asked for a membership action plan at the time, and they'd been refused it by many of the other members of NATO, including the Germans and the French and others, who didn't think they were ready, but also didn't want to provoke the Russians, because by this time it was becoming clear by things that Putin had said that he was opposed to any further NATO enlargement beyond the Baltic states and other countries that had been brought in. And they thought this would be provocative, but instead of basically pushing back and denying the membership action plan, because the United States, President Bush and Vice President Cheney had decided that they wanted to support Georgia and Ukraine's application, the other NATO members scrambled around to find what they thought might be a compromise, which is not now, but yes, at some point. That wasn't a compromise, it was a strategic blunder. Because what Putin saw was that, again, we'd thrown what we said were all of our rules for NATO out of the window, and that we were basically saying that Ukraine and Georgia would be part of NATO, but we weren't saying when or how. And so I was the national intelligence advisor at the time for Russia and Eurasia. And we worried in the intelligence community that we would see preemptive Russian military action. And within 4 months in Georgia, we did, with the invasion of Georgia. And we thought that Russia might invade Ukraine then, and they didn't, because Ukraine pulled back from NATO membership. So I've been kind of anticipating something like this happening for some time. But I want to say again that it's not just because of NATO, because Putin has this whole concoction of history, feelings of grievance because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's all fed together into this decision to make a move against Ukraine right now.
So I want to ask you more about that, because you said also a few minutes ago, it would have been better had the alliance figured out how to communicate, even as it was taking on more offensive kinds of operations in the former Yugoslavia, in Iraq and Afghanistan, how we could have reassured Russia that this military power, this coordination wouldn't be used against Russia. But this is what I want to ask. Given the nature of the Russian regime, particularly under Putin, starting in the late 1990s, was there anything that the United States or the West or NATO could have done to change, to soften the nature of that regime? Because we know already in the late 1990s that Putin in particular was an extremely brutal leader who seemingly would go to any means in order to achieve power.
Yeah, and you're referring to the way that Putin came into power in 1999. So he comes into power on the back of what is the second war in Chechnya, part of the Russian Federation in the south and what's also the North Caucasus, the south of Russia, but in the North Caucasus. And the Chechens, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, also tried to secede from the Russian Federation. There were parts of Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia that did this. Nagorno-Karabakh tried to secede from Azerbaijan. There was a whole host of these kinds of smaller constituent parts of states that also hoped that they themselves could have independence. And what happened is then Russia brutally suppressed the Chechen secession, starting in 1994 under Boris Yeltsin, when they sent in troops, in fact, doing the same as what we've seen in Ukraine since February 2024. They thought that they would go in, suppress the rebellion, put down the opposition, get rid of the leadership there and put their own person in, and it turned into a grinding war that went on for best part of a decade. And when Putin takes over as the head of the FSB, the successor of the KGB, the security services have already moved in because the military has failed to suppress the Chechens. And they're carrying out all kinds of nasty subversive actions, running their own kind of terrorist groups, assassinating people, taking people's families hostage, all the kinds of really sort of nasty, horrible things that we might have read and heard about, including assassinating people with poison, by the way, as well, just that we've seen with the use of polonium and Novichok. And there also is a series of really horrifying events in some Russian cities where some apartment buildings are blown up in the middle of the night with people in them. So very heavy casualties. And this was blamed on Chechens and others from the North Caucasus. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence pointing in the direction of this being a false flag operation. There's a number of people who have written about this. John Dunlop, for example, a professor at Stanford who wrote a book about this, investigating it. And a lot of, as I said, things pointing in the direction that this may well have been a false flag operation by the services or people associated with them to basically facilitate the absolute clampdown on Chechnya. And this is as Putin comes into power. And so as Putin is a president, he becomes a wartime president. And he basically says, they're going to wipe the Chechens out. And he proceeds to preside over the flattening of Grozny, the regional capital of Chechnya, and the taking out of the leadership there, no compromise. This doesn't bode well, by the way, for Ukraine now. No compromise with them. And pushing then to have his own people put in place. And we get Ramzan Kadyrov, a really kind of brutal ruler, is all one can really term him of Chechnya, and Chechens who have been then created into a paramilitary force, even fighting in Ukraine right now. So we can see there a kind of a pattern, and this kind of carries on the way through Putin's presidency from the beginning to now, where we see it. But there is also a very pragmatic streak to Putin. After 9/11, he did actually reach out to the United States, trying to make common cause over Chechnya, to be honest, but basically reaching out, understanding that the United States was going to have to react, and kind of offering assistance, because been there, done that, the Soviet period, moving into Afghanistan as well. And there were, some efforts initially early on by Putin to, as I said, assist. But he thought that in return he would get basically a blind eye turned to what was happening in Chechnya, which didn't happen. And in terms of NATO, we set up a NATO-Russia Council that, you've done work on, back in 1997. But Russia always anticipated that they would have a veto over what NATO was doing. A veto over enlargement, which didn't happen, and a veto over NATO operations that they didn't really like. And so part of the problem all the way along is that Putin has been insisting on being consulted, but also been given a free hand in his own affairs. That notwithstanding, I do think that we needed to be much more attentive to maintaining that relationship. And there's one thing for us to bear in mind. We talked about Putin, 22 years in office. Just think about how many NATO Secretary Generals, how many kind of political advisory staff in NATO. He's seen how many US presidents, how many national security advisors, secretaries of state. That's part of the problem. He's one guy who stayed in place with essentially the same guys around him that he's moved around in different places, but they're all, pretty much the hard men who entered the system with him. Many of the people he's known since his own childhood in Leningrad. And we've just changed over and over again. So Putin often complains that there's no one to talk to. And what he means is there's not the same person to talk to. He's even, here as two women, sitting up here. I've heard on, good authority from a colleague that he thinks that we troll him all the time by, all the women, that we've had, kind of as national security advisors, secretaries of state, kind of experts on Russia. He just kind of thinks that everyone's messing around with him, not respecting him, not paying attention. And that's the nature, getting back to it again, of our democracies. That's what he feels like in Ukraine. He wants to have his guy, someone he thinks he can talk to, who understands what he's saying, the language he's speaking. So we should have figured out, somewhere within the context of having this NATO-Russia Council, of having, perhaps some continuity of the people who were talking to him, figuring out how to sort of interpret into his way and engaging with him. Now, that would have been extremely difficult, but I think we should have been very attentive again to the way that he frames things and the way that he sees things in the world.
Those people should have been women, for sure.
Well, Angela Merkel really knew how to talk to him. So, I think in some respects, the fact that she's gone was one of the precipitating factors for, some of the decision-making about invasion, because she actually spoke Russian, so she could speak to him in his own language, and he speaks German really well. So, in a way, things weren't lost in translation between the two of them.
Good. So I do want to talk about Germany and the Western reaction to the nature of the regime as you just discussed it, because despite all of that conduct, and this isn't to say that during the same period the United States isn't also engaged in its own questionable conduct, I'll just put it that way, but Germany, despite all of this, develops a very close energy relationship, economic dependency. That's, of course, an interdependent relationship, but it is one of the main things that prevents, right now, a more robust sanctions regime. So the international response has in many ways been very robust. We've read about that, it's unprecedented. But in some sense, I'm sitting here thinking, well, it's still not very good, because the Europeans and the Germans in particular are still buying all that oil and gas from Russia. And so I know you've done tremendous work in this area. What is your assessment in retrospect of what the West might have done differently in light of what we knew the whole time about the nature of this regime? What could we have done differently? What should we be doing now? in order to limit the interdependence that makes it possible, frankly, for Russia to continue to fund a war that is decimating a country?
Well, there's been this debate between the United States and Europe going back to the Cold War about interdependence. And I'm sure that many of you, will be familiar with this debate because the United States opposed, right since the Reagan era, the building of pipelines bringing gas and oil from the Soviet Union to Europe. It was said right from the very beginning, this was a really bad decision. It was a mistake. Because the period in the Cold War, the United States was very skeptical that interdependence would actually bring better relations with the Soviet Union and then ultimately with Russia, and was worried that this would become a source of leverage, political leverage, which of course it has become. So the United States has actually been consistent over every administration, going back to the sort of 70s and 80s when there was first a decision on the part of Germany and others to buy oil and gas from the Soviet Union, that this was unadvisable. And we opposed not just the Soviet-era pipelines, but Nord Stream 1. We've been talking about Nord Stream 2 all this time, but there was a 1, and it's still operating. And that was in the Bush administration, and again, I was National Intelligence Officer at the time, and we were trying to work with our European counterparts, and the Germans in particular, to dissuade them of this decision. There's also pipelines across the Black Sea to Turkey. We've tried at many occasions to basically get across the idea that this was a mistake. Now the flip is in Germany, a very complex relationship, and the Germans, all the way going back to Willy Brandt and other leaders and their Ostpolitik, their Eastern policy, really believed that it was their duty in many respects, their obligation to try to improve the relationship with the Soviet Union and then later with Russia because of what Germany had done during the war. So again, really complex. But every German leader that you talk to really has a lot of guilt, understandable, from what happened to the Soviet Union, just the heavy casualties that Nazi Germany inflicted on the Soviet Union. Not just Russians, obviously, but Ukrainians and Kazakhs and Crimean Tatars and Jews and you name it. Every people in the multi-ethnic, multi-confessional Soviet Union suffered at the hands of the Nazis. Some obviously more than others, but again, millions of people, tens of millions of people killed. And this was weighed heavily in contemporary German politics. And so there's been, I would say, persistence in thinking that closer relationships with the Soviet Union and with Russia will not just atone for the past, but build a new productive relationship. And then as a resistance then to the admonitions from the United States and others about the risks of this close interdependent relationship. And one would have thought that in 2006, when the Russians switched off the gas to Ukraine, that this would have made the point about the leverage, but it didn't. Because the Germans dismissed this as kind of being part of misunderstandings, and they were always kind of worried about the expansion of NATO and other issues, and really trying to kind of understand the Russian perspective. But the annexation of Crimea still didn't seem to make the point. But it's only now that realization that the energy and the interdependence has not created a better relationship, but that has actually created a massive vulnerability has sunk in. And we're seeing now Germany react very strongly, but as you said, it's very hard for them to unwind what has been decades of interdependence with Russia on an energy front. And in fact, the German economic miracle of the last several decades has been precisely because of cheap gas coming directly from Russia. Because Germany remains an energy-intensive economy, metallurgy, auto manufacturing, and they were also seeing gas as their bridge fuel, like we've been doing as well in the United States, to renewables and to a lower carbon footprint and to dealing with climate change. And now they've been really caught out. I mean, we all recall as well that they decided to pull back from nuclear power after the terrible accident in Fukushima in Japan. I think people have pointed out that Germany isn't a particularly seismic country and is unlikely to experience a tsunami. So it was kind of, nuclear plants could probably be, built to a different specification there. But there's just been a real anxiety that developed in Germany as a result of, what they saw happening in Japan. Also, kind of worries about, the long-term storage of spent fuel. I mean, we all have that here as well. And then they even went so far as not wanting to take electricity that was generated by nuclear power across from the border in France. So the Germans made, it has to be said, a lot of pretty poor decisions on their fuel mix. And now, in terms of what has to be done, they've made an announcement of, I think it's something like 200 billion euros into renewables to try to fast track this. I mean, we're grappling with all of that here. We know you can't really fast track it. It's going to be difficult. But they now know that they have to move. But it's going to take some time to wean themselves off, Russian gas. Now, Putin has talked about cutting it off now anyway, gas and oil, trying to shift to, sell more to China and to other countries. That won't be that easy either, but it's feasible. But we're now having the kinds of debates that really we'd been trying to have, I would say, for the last 10 plus years.
Thank you. I have one more question on the international response and context, and then we'll move to your questions. So this last question has to do with recent reporting about U.S. intelligence gathering capacities regarding the conflict, and perhaps revelations that U.S. officials have been able to put out there about stuff Americans know, including about a recent request by Putin of China that they provide military and financial support. How important are these intelligence revelations? How nervous does this make China? How do we understand, if you know, how China is viewing this conflict and the Western response to it?
Well, first of all, about the uses of intelligence. So when I was a national intelligence officer, one of my jobs was warning. And when we got intelligence and information about an impending disaster or, kind of the invasion of Georgia, for example, we had to warn up our chain about this. And warning is a difficult thing to do because a lot of times, nobody believes it when you tell them. Remember Cassandra at Troy? I mean, every intelligence person is really Cassandra. Who, said, look, that horse over there, I wouldn't bring that in. And, I think this is going to turn out badly. And it did. And Cassandra suffered greatly from it as well. It didn't really, she goes down in history as, the kind of unsuccessful intelligence officer, I guess. And, when we warned that there was going to be an invasion of Georgia, people didn't really want to hear it. And there was one. And we still got accused of intelligence failures afterwards because we didn't specify what day, exactly how, what would the trigger be. We just knew that it was highly likely. Now, in this case, there's been something really unusual done. It's not just that the intel guys have been warning up the chain, but the top of the chain, the very top of the chain, President Biden has decided that he really needed to do something about this as well. And I think there's been a shift over the last several years when we've been seeing these repeated patterns in Russian behavior to try to call them out, because when we don't do that, they control the information space or the disinformation space, right? And so when I kind of think back to some of the things that the Russians have done in the past, or that Putin has done, a lot of things spring to mind. But, I mentioned before cruel and unusual assassination attempts and poisons, right? So Alexander Litvinenko, the former Russian spy who's poisoned with polonium in London, we were pretty sure that Putin gave the order to do that. So he turns Alexander Litvinenko into the first dirty bomb in human form. It's pretty horrific. A horrible death. Polonium spread all the way over London. Not insufficient amounts to hurt anybody else, but, the Russians pretty much figured we wouldn't call them out and they could just, play with it as much as they would. It could only be traced back to them, by the way. And, the likelihood that Putin had an order that was pretty low. But, we restrained ourselves because people were worried about, they always worry about sources and methods, how you find this information out. would then there be some kind of repercussions. But it's also the case that intel people and spies like to keep their information to themselves. Information is power. But in this case, disinformation was power. And the Russians went around, Russians get blamed for everything, basically poking fun at us, trolling us. And then they do it again, even more spectacular and dangerous and brazen fashion, rubbing a weapons-grade nerve agent all over a doorknob of another former Russian spy, Sergei Skripal, who was there with his daughter in the small British town of Salisbury. And the assassins in this case, they put the Novichok in a perfume bottle. I think it was like Lancome perfume. And then they discard it in the donation bin of a charity store where it's found by a Russian woman and her partner, Dawn Sturgis. She thinks it's perfume, sprays it on her wrist, and dies. And there was enough in that perfume bottle to kill 4,000 people. If it had been dropped and spilled or basically transferred, and there were other people got hurt by this. There was a policeman, and there were others actually. But the reason that we don't know all the information yet that's been made public is because there's an inquest into Dawn Sturgis's death, and in Britain, inquests take forever. You might recall after Princess Diana died in the traffic tunnel in Paris, it took years for the inquest to come all the way through. So you can't basically release all of the information. But Theresa May made this amazing decision, and this is the turning point, to call the Russians out, because they knew they should call them out after the use of polonium, and that the Russians were making fun of the British government after this. And so she called them out and said this was Novichok, and most people didn't know this existed. The Russians had said that they destroyed all of their chemical weapons, and yet they'd maintained these stocks of a nerve agent. And the Russians also wanted to play with this because this assassination attempt took place near Portadown, which is the equivalent of Fort Detrick, which is a highly classified British research lab. And also there's military bases around there. And, Sergei Skripal was housed there, probably because, he was a former spy and was being kept an eye on, by British intelligence. And they probably thought Salisbury was a pretty safe place to keep him there. But the Russians took advantage of all of this to then say this was a false flag operation, that the British had done it. And then they said the Czechs had done it or the Swedes had done it. And, basically they were making fun of everybody. And again, taking up the information space with disinformation, some people believed them. And so watching all of this, our system, kind of has seen these kinds of things happen. And there's been increasingly a decision that we've got to call the Russians out, put a spotlight, transparency on what they're doing. And so this is basically what the government did. And I think it was very sensible because they got ahead of this. And look, they were right, weren't they? They said there was going to be an imminent invasion. People pushed back. I mean, I hesitated too. I thought, well, he might, change his mind. He's got that option. But maybe, it might change his mind. But they were pretty convinced that he'd made his mind up, and they were right. And they went out and they warned others. There was a lot of skepticism, a lot of pushback from other governments, the French in particular, because the French, of course, said that Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And that, they, ever since then, have basically been pretty skeptical about the United States and thinking that of us manipulating intelligence. So there was a pretty good reason for them to disbelieve. But I joined the Intelligence Council, the National Intelligence Council, in the wake of that, when everyone was trying to clean up their act, and they tried to bring people in from the outside to challenge the intelligence, so that we wouldn't do things like that again and have things politicized. But still hard going. And I think that, again, was a really important decision. But it does make things quite complicated because it's going to be quite hard for us to keep up with this. There is, of course, the real risk of people pushing back. And you asked about China, and the Chinese didn't believe this either. We've heard in the press that the administration went to them, gave them the information, they told the Russians, and that they didn't seem to believe it either. And I'm not a China scholar, but I'm watching this very closely because it's not entirely clear whether the Chinese government, President Xi, fully understood what Putin was going to do. And they made a really quite astounding decision in early February around the margins of the Beijing Olympics to throw their lot in with Russia. This bilateral agreement on their relationship, saying that their relationship knew no limits, that they were also opposed to NATO enlargement. This is really the first time that China has involved itself in European politics, because they spoke out against NATO enlargement. And yes, there are NATO members that operate in the Asia-Pacific, not just the United States and Canada, but also France and the United Kingdom. But it's hardly that NATO is a threat to China. So China had made this conscious decision to become a political actor in the European security space, not just an economic actor. And so now, in some respects, China's kind of responsible for what's happened here, because they said to Putin, we've got your back. And in fact, the Russians withdrew troops from the border with China and moved them over to Ukraine for this invasion, which is the first time that the Russians have left their Far Eastern border so lightly guarded. So clearly the Chinese told them, don't worry about us. They're not worried about the Japanese or the Mongolians, so, kind of you've got a free hand here. So I think, our diplomatic efforts to reach out to China, we should also be emphasizing to them, you've said that you support independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of countries. You're always saying that. You yourself were the victims in World War II of occupation and invasion. So what are you doing here? China has prospered on the back of the rules-based system that we've built up since World War II. China's been a major investor in Europe. China was the single biggest country investor in Ukraine. Not bigger than the European Union collectively, but China had no beef with Ukraine, and yet they have permitted basically the devastation of Ukraine. Yep. So I think there has to be some pressure on China there, not just from the United States, but from other countries, European countries collectively and individually as well. And basically a question about what is China's intentions here. And I think some of us hope that perhaps if China has some disapproval, I don't know how hopeful I am about this, that might be also instrumental in getting Putin to step back from this terrible war.
Good, thank you for that explanation. I would love to take some questions from the audience at this point. So I've got a gentleman right here, if you want to go ahead. If you say your question, I will repeat it into the microphone.
Dr. Hill, you were quoted in the New York Times this morning as saying that there's a possibility of a false flag operation involving either chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. Can you talk about that? And also, it's been my understanding there's been a tradition of communication between our military and the Russian military. Has that continued, or is that gone by the board?
Good. I'm going to repeat those two questions for the recording and also for people in the back. So the question was, could there be a false flag operation in Ukraine involving a biological or nuclear weapon? And then the second part of the question had to do with communication, I think military to military communication between the United States and Russia, and whether that's still ongoing.
Well, I'll answer the last bit first. We still have communications between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, and his counterpart on the Russian side, General Gerasimov. And that has kind of continued at all points. When the war in Syria was at its hottest points, we actually had very intensive communications on the ground there with our commanders of Central Command and the Russian forces there. And that was vital, because you may also recall that the Russian paramilitaries fired on our special forces there in 2018. And there was a really nasty firefight in which there was hundreds of Russian casualties. And the important thing about this was a subversive covert operation carried out by paramilitary forces from the Wagner group, not the regular military. And the regular military, at least on the ground, knew nothing about it. Whether Putin or somebody at the top knew is another matter. And we were able to basically deal with that, because it could have been pretty catastrophic, as you can imagine, a firefight between Russians and US special forces. And all the way through the Cold War, as you're alluding to, we had these deconfliction mechanisms, and we've been very keen to try to work on these again. I'm not quite sure how it's been working out over the last several weeks, but I do know that we've been trying to push to get these kinds of processes and mechanisms in place and to build them up. And this was something that we've always been concerned about in the NATO context, to be able to maintain that. Now, on the false flag issues, was warning about that again, the warning procedure, because there was a pattern emerging. And it wasn't just chemical, it was not just biological and nuclear, but also chemical. We see the Russians starting to accuse us of maybe carrying these out. In fact, even before the invasion, you might recall that the Russians were actually saying that the United States might be planning a chemical attack, a false flag in Ukraine. Now we see them do this over and over again in Syria. So in Syria, the Russians basically stood by while the Syrian forces of Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons. Chlorine, basic mustard gas, and others that we suspected that they were using, and we were investigating those samples in The Hague at the Organization for the Prohibition of the Use of Chemical Weapons, which the Russians hacked those labs, by the way, to try to disrupt all of those tests. And each time the Russians would blame this on the Syrian opposition or the White Helmets, which was kind of the equivalent of the sort of Red Cross who were trying to rescue people. And just like in the case of polonium and Novichok, blaming it on others when they were actually doing this themselves. So there's a clear pattern here. And the Russians have accused, again, the Ukrainians of trying to have a nuclear weapon. Well, we remember they gave up nuclear weapons in the early 1990s. One of the reasons that they've taken over Chernobyl and the exclusion zone there, is because of the and Zaporizhia, this other massive nuclear plant, is because they kind of, accusing the Ukrainians, perhaps as, we've seen the Iranians doing, of using civilian, nuclear power as a cover for something else, so that they're already spinning things out. They have accused us of, running biolabs. It's not the first time they've accused us, by the way, of doing this in Ukraine. They've also accused us of doing this in Georgia and Armenia, because the Soviets had a whole host of biolabs, like Portadown in the UK, like Fort Detrick and others, in Maryland, where they did conduct experiments into biological and chemical weapons. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union, most of those have been doing, research into biohazards, like COVID, for example, because, this is a disease that we've all been, basically dealing with, that's jumped from animals into humans. And, they're looking at anthrax, similar, zootopic, diseases. And those things have been conducted in Ukraine, to do research. They're doing work on vaccine, for example. But this is classic, for the Russians to do this, because they may be planning on doing something themselves as a pretext. And this is the same thing of going on nuclear alert and threatening us with the potential use of a nuclear weapon, even when this seems disproportionate to what's actually happening in terms of the risk to Russia. Because Putin is always trying to scare people with the idea that he will cross that threshold of using an instrument that he has, to deadly effect. And again, he's done this repeatedly in ways that people haven't expected. So the purpose of raising this is to warn people that Putin is trying to contemplate the use of these false flag operations or nuclear or chemical weapons, and that we need to take action to push back against this. Again, reaching out to the international community, to the Chinese and others. I mean, after Skripal, I myself was heavily involved in calling, around to our European and other allies, explaining what the Russians had done and why this was impermissible, why this wasn't just a spy-on-spy attack, but they'd put at risk the entire population of the town of Salisbury. I mean, what would the Russians have reacted to if we'd done that in one of their historic cathedral cities like Vladimir or Suzdal, for example? I mean, there would have been outrage. I mean, if this had happened in any other setting, we would have been outraged by it. But, basically, Putin's propaganda and his, kind of use of disinformation and, accusing us of false flag operations basically distracted everybody. So again, we have to be very clear about what they may be contemplating doing and to push back and to get, the rest of our partners and allies and others, out in the United Nations frame, China and else, and others to take some action against this and to call it out. So it's calling it out again.
Good, thank you. So I see a gentleman down here from before. I'll get to as many of you as I can, but go ahead.
Kiev is a city with a population of about 3 to 4 million people. There are still at least 1 million, maybe 1.5 million people, who I compare to a woman whose ex-husband, an abusive husband, is coming back to take her back, threatening to rape and kill her if she doesn't submit. How many thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent Ukrainian lives do we need to watch suffer starvation, freezing, murder, bombardment, until we do something that would actually stop Putin?
I'm going to summarize the question. So the question is, at what point, given the destruction of Kiev in particular, I think the US or others intervene militarily to stop this atrocity that's unfolding?
The analogy used, by the way, has been actually said to me by many women who work in basically shelters for abused women. So I had a friend who actually does this, who actually used the exact analogy and said that watching this, Putin is behaving like many of the enraged spouses that they try to keep away, you know, who want to like burn down the house with their wife and children in it because they've basically gone away from them. So this analogy has been used, and in fact, Radek Sikorski, former foreign minister of Poland, has made a similar analogy. He's now an MEP, in the way that, you know, Russia treats former subject countries. And, you know, it's very clear that Putin has now gone from seeing Ukrainians as a fraternal people. He was, you know, not so long ago writing essays saying that Ukrainians and Russians were one people, not just part of one family, but one people. And now to seeing them not just as enemies, but even traitors to be crushed. And it's, as you're, you know, suggesting here, he intends to go the whole way in terms of, you know, leveling the place. Now, stopping him isn't all that easy, unfortunately. And I think, you know, we can all see basically what's going on here. And we have to be creative and consistent and persistent in trying to basically push this back. Because one of the problems that we have is that Putin is the kind of person that if he thinks that we're going after him and, you know, we're into regime change, and that, you know, people saying that this doesn't stop until we've got rid of Vladimir Putin, is he's going to double, triple, and quadruple down. And so, as unpleasant as it is, we have to kind of start to figure out, and this is why we need this really intensive international negotiation, how to create for him what the great Chinese military thinker Sun Tzu called the Golden Bridge. It's not just an off-ramp. He doesn't want an off-ramp. He wants us to take an off-ramp, basically. He's already said, just in the last couple of days, to world leaders that this is going according to plan, and he doesn't intend to stop until the Ukrainians submit to his demands. So we have to basically get him to the negotiating table to stop and to halt the hostilities. But it's not going to happen by just continuing to throw, you know, military support to Ukraine at him, or even engaging further from NATO, because he kind of wants that. Basically, he's been saying, we've been talking about this right from the very beginning, that NATO's out to get him. He wants this conflict to be between Russia and NATO, which is why he's trying to provoke us right now by firing close to the Polish border, you know, daring us to come in, saying that, you know, military convoys from NATO are basically going to be targets. Because he wants to draw attention away from the fact that this is a post-imperial, post-colonial grab for Ukraine, all along these kind of analogies that this is about him basically subjugating, wiping out Ukraine. He wants it to be this larger historic struggle between a malevolent West, a United States that's always tried to keep Russia down, especially over the last 30 years, and a NATO that's been encroaching on Russian territory. In terms of encroaching on Russian territory, there's only actually two very small parts of Russian territory that border a NATO country. One with Norway in the Barents region, and the other around this exclave of Kaliningrad with Poland and Lithuania on either side, 6% of Russian territory. The largest border with Russia is not with NATO, it's with China and Mongolia and Kazakhstan. And China's just told him, don't worry. So he's trying to goad us into this so we can tell the Chinese and everybody else that we're in a conflict. So that's the reason why we're all treading very carefully. So trying to blunt the military effort, trying to cut off his ability to conduct this war by crippling the Russian economy, trying to kind of keep pushing on international diplomacy It's not satisfying. I mean, there's 50,000 plus Ukrainians gone back to fight in the war. There's a whole international brigade developing here. This is like the Spanish Civil War of our period. You know, I don't know whether George Orwell's and Ernest Hemingway's are going to come out of this, but this is a defining moment. You know, I have friends in the former British military who are going over there now. I keep trying to text them and say, please don't do this, you know, because, you know, they're older, you know, probably they're going to, you know, it's been a long while since, you know, they've probably run more than, you know, 10 yards to the pub or something, you know, so they're not exactly in the best of shape. But people are getting, you know, really riled up, just, you know, as you are. I mean, I am too. I mean, we're all, you know, basically appalled and disgusted by all of this, but we have to act in a calm, collected fashion, be creative, be really persistent, and try to kind of choke off his ability to do this in all kinds of different ways. So we have to come at this from all kinds of different angles. But we have to know what the stakes are. The stakes are just that you've laid them out here. At this point, all pretense has been thrown out the window, and Putin wants to destroy Ukraine.
Good, I'm going to call on the woman in the colorful scarf right there.
If there's any scenario by which you think the pressure of the oligarchs that are now on the record as against the war could be made to influence Putin's decision making.
So the question was whether some of the oligarchs who might be prepared to defect from Putin's agenda could change Putin's mind.
Yeah, and some of the oligarchs who've spoken out against it, you were saying as well, spoken out against the war. Yeah. Well, oligarchs as a term, you know, comes from basically the 1990s when Boris Yeltsin was really very much under the sway of the richest men in Russia because the state was bankrupt, and you know he wasn't really, you know, able to conduct policy without their support. Putin, when he came into power in the 2000s, basically pushed the oligarchs out of politics. Now, and he's got his own crop of oligarchs, some of whom are very close to him. They're people who he grew up with, actually, in, you know, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, worked his way through the KGB with and went into government with, and they do have some influence over him. But the people who have plotted this invasion with him are not those guys who have super yachts in, you know, off Malta, or palaces in Monaco, or, you know, rows of townhouses in London, you know, for example. They're the hard guys of the security services and the Russian military who actually loathe the oligarchs and, you know, the kind of the rich business people. And, you know, kind of harken back to that era when the Soviet Union was self-sufficient and a great superpower and, you know, basically had autarky. Now, Putin himself doesn't really think like this. This is a guy who's lived large and really enjoyed his life. I mean, if any of you have seen the video that Alexei Navalny produced of his ridiculously large and bizarre palace down in the Black Sea, where he clearly, you know, wanted to spend his retirement watching pole dancing, gambling at his own casino, and drinking wine from his own vineyard. You know, you've got to see that this isn't a guy who was really, you know, ready for nuclear war in some level, or from cutting, you know, Russia off from, you know, the global economy. But he's surrounded himself over the most recent time by, you know, people who are thinking like him and his worldview and wanting to conquer, you know, Ukraine again, redress all of the wrongs that they believe that Russia has had made against it by the United States and NATO, the humiliations of the last 30 years. They want to teach us all a lesson. So it's going to take some time, I think, for the shock in the system to the Russian economy to really percolate through into this, to, you know, to be a backlash from all the people who've also really enjoyed their wealth and swanning around in Europe, their kids, you know, maybe, you know, Putin's ex-wife, his daughters, you know, all of his cousins and, you know, their children, you know, eventually as they all get squeezed by this, as well as ordinary Russians, that will have an impact over time. But it's also more likely that the crushing of the Russian economy, and I don't say this with any pleasure, because I think it's an absolute tragedy, particularly as we're sitting here with WorldDenver, you know, where we've had all these exchanges with Russia. My own, you know, hometown in the north of England, we had a wonderful exchange that I benefited from with Kostroma region in the Yaroslavl province of Russia, wonderful, Russian friends. This is not on the Russian people, but it's that crushing of the economy is going to be one of the few things that really gets Putin's attention, because at the beginning of his presidency, Putin wanted Russia to be one of the top 5 economies in the world. It was when Russia was in the G8. He wanted to really belong in the G8. And there was even a slogan early on in his presidencies about Russia number 5 or number 6. They basically wanted the economy to be a world-class economy. And this is reversing 30 years of developments from the whole period of dislocation and basically the Russian economy crashing completely, the being insolvent and bankrupt in the 1990s, to what Putin has built up over the last 22 years. It's all coming down. And so far, he's basically told the head of the central bank and the head of the economy, the finance ministers, well, you're just going to have to adapt and deal with it. Well, there's only so much they can adapt and deal with. And when that realization comes in, perhaps then, that will be the moment, to try to dissuade him from going further. And we're hoping also that, world leaders are basically saying to him, look, what happened here? You had all of these interactions. Russia was there was demand for Russia in the world economy and in world politics, which is something Putin always says he wants to have. And now you're a pariah state. But I do think it's going to take some time for this to sink in. And I'm not, I have to say, particularly hopeful, which gets why I get back to my response to your question. It's going to be a really long, hard slog to turn him away from this path. And he's going to have to be able to spin it to himself that this has all been worth it. I mean, he's telling the Russian people right now that this is going to make us stronger. That, basically we're going to be living on our own resources. And he's going to have to try to find out whether the Chinese or the Indians or others will help him beat sanctions. But if other people can, basically come and tell him, will he shoot the messenger, will he listen to the message? It's the poor old warning guys again who say, look, the economy's in a collapse. We need to cut this off right now. And give him some way of spinning this as a success. It's only going to be, my mic ran out there. That's it, the economy has to run out. Basically to get him to change his mind and to pull back. And I'm not confident that that's going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Fiona Hill. We are now, unfortunately, out of time and out of mic. But just at the end here, I also want to thank you for your incredible service to this country and to global affairs.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Hill and Dr. Epstein. We apologize for the challenges of the microphone, but I'm quite convinced this isn't the most challenging room that Dr. Hill has been in before. She's pretty good at challenging rooms. So thank you again so much. Everyone, please join me in giving a huge round of applause to our speaker and moderator.